Thank you for bearing with me. Welcome, everyone, to Engaging Communities to Prevent Sexual Violence. My name is Maya Pilgrim. I'm the Primary Prevention Specialist with TAASA. And joining me here today are the amazing Emiliano and Denise, my teammates over here at TAASA. I'm really happy to have all of you join us today. I'm going to give you full transparency before we get into this, that I found this topic a little difficult to develop into a webinar format, to essentially talk about something that relies on interaction basically by myself for an hour. So I'm really going to be encouraging you all to share your thoughts, your questions, your resources, into the chat box as we go along, and I'll be asking you some direct questions. Please don't understand them to be rhetorical. Please go ahead and put your input into the chat box. For those of you who have been in a training with me, you know that I'm not very good at just going off and talking without looking for input, so I'm going to see how I can integrate that into this webinar as well. During the webinar, I'm going to be talking about the approach that I think is necessary for community engagement, what I mean when I'm saying community engagement, and then towards the end of it, we'll get into the nuts and bolts of how that approach might look like on the ground. And it's a bit challenging to design a webinar for all levels, so this is really meant to provide a grounding for those who are new to the work, and there are quite a few people who are new to Texas prevention work. And for those who've been at it a little bit longer, hopefully this will be a good refresher and that you'll be able to find some good tools to add to your toolbox towards the latter half of the webinar that'll help spark ideas. That said, it is an hour and 15-minute webinar, so this will not be comprehensive by any means, but I will be talking about a lot of different resources and tools along the way. So if those interest you, I just don't have the capacity or time to get into them individually. So I do have a resources page set up, so I encourage you to delve deeper into those if they seem very interesting to you. So you're going to notice a kind of aquatic theme to my slides, which might be because I'm ready for summer, but also because I'm trying to be intentional about who and how I represent when we're talking about communities. I think fish probably don't mind me using their images. There is no pretest. And I think that there are really valuable analogies there to kind of talk about community engagement and these kind of ecosystems that we reside in. And I liked this picture in particular because it reminds me of a story I think a lot of people are familiar with, of that child walking down the beach where there's a string of starfish on the shore and the child's picking them up one by one and checking them back into the ocean. And along comes a doom and gloom adult who says, "What are you doing? You can't save all of them." And the child picks up a starfish and says, "Well, I can save this one," and chucks it into the water. And I think this story is fairly indicative of how people think of community-level prevention and where a lot of prevention efforts have been focused. And so on that kind of individual change, and it's a matter of getting a curriculum to certain young people and sees change in communities by adding up the individuals that curriculum has affected. So I'll be challenging that a little bit during this webinar as an incomplete strategy, as necessary but insufficient. And the reason being that communities have the ability to be greater than the sum of its parts. If we think about our hand, we have 5 fingers and a palm, and they're not just, individual fingers and a thumb and a palm, but they can act together to harm or to help. And individuals are part of that. They influence their communities, but the communities and the people working in them are a greater force entirely. And what's challenging about this subject matter and developing this into a webinar is that it's really not formulaic, because it's just not simple. Communities aren't simple. Communities are complex and they're complicated and at times contradictory. And as we, go about community engagement, we have to respect that. But hopefully we'll talk about the right building blocks and get a good foundation so that we can build great things and let those more harmful and toxic structures crumble from disuse. Before I get really into it, I want to give gratitude to my teachers in community engagement who have really taught me what this looks like in practice, and that this is long-term work that's founded on building relationships and ample amounts of humility. The image here is a typical bangko, a type of boat used in the Philippines that's definitely easy to maneuver when you've got people helping you and helping you to navigate. And on a similar vein, I want to give thanks to the local experts who I've kind of integrated into this webinar. Some of whom have moved on to other work from the rape crisis centers that they were at, but some who are still there. And two of them, Shelley and Crystal, who have received Visionary Voice Awards because of their dedication and ingenuity in their community engagement work. So I've included a couple of their nuggets of wisdom into the webinar that you'll see a little bit later on. So I'd like to take this time to just kind of get an idea of where you all are at. So if you could please, into the chat box, just give us an idea of what is one way that your community engages with a particular community, your agency engages with a particular community. Okay, yeah, I was like, this either means that nobody's doing community outreach work, or so we've got tabling, health fairs, outreach, work with police departments, go into schools, have support groups. Thank you guys for sharing. Participation at events, information tables. Excellent. I think that's a lot of what I was expecting to see. Task force with law enforcement, right? Works closely with law enforcement, medical, and community outreach. So I see a lot of outreach and education, some training and participation, lots of tabling, connecting to different agencies. Excellent. All right. Professional training, fantastic. So just to give you guys an idea of what I mean when I'm talking about community engagement, a lot of times we see community engagement as a way to tell people about us. But when I say community engagement, I'm really not talking about outreach. I'm really not talking about marketing. I'm really talking about engagement, which would be a two-way interaction with the community. So what I'm going to be focusing a lot on in this webinar is going to be a shift to thinking about how we meaningfully have a two-way interaction and engagement with communities, which requires less bullhorns and a little bit more ears. And the reason why I think this is important is because a rape crisis center, just by manner of being, is not the answer to sexual violence, right? Like as an advocate or as a prevention worker, this should bring you a good deal of relief. So rest easy. Ending sexual violence in your community does not rest squarely on your shoulders. And it won't end unless we figure out how we are going to meaningfully engage entire communities in our work, right? When I did this workshop recently at the TAASA conference, I asked a room of about 20 who was familiar with the history of the anti-sexual violence movement. And I think again, out of a room of maybe of more than 20, I think 2 or 3 hands went up, which I think kind of tells you something about where we've kind of gone. We're familiar with names like Gloria Steinem or Emma Watson when she makes a really big speech at the UN, but the movement itself has its roots in women of color activists and community organizing as early as 1866. And we've become less familiar with names like Lucy Smith and Frances Thompson, who testified before Congress about the sexual violence they experienced during the Memphis riots, and about, we know the names Sojourner Truth and Ain't I a Woman, but just thinking about how she was, one of the first people to talk about that intersection of gender and race. And I think more and more people are becoming aware of Rosa Parks and Recy Taylor, and how that kind of response to rampant sexual violence happening in African American communities sparked the civil rights movement. But our movement has kind of taken a step away from that and become more professionalized, right? And funding has become more centralized, and it's turned more towards a social service model, which has kind of distanced us from our community organizing roots, which really relies on the community to drive the change. So I'm going to kind of harken back a little bit more to that, as opposed to the more standard things that we typically think about when we're talking about community engagement, like tabling. So on our little journey, I'm going to share with you what I consider my compasses in community engagement, which is that in trying to figure out like what my true north is, it's really thinking about relationships and connections, really thinking about power and how power is shared, and really thinking about concepts like responsibility and accountability, and to whom we are accountable and responsible to in our work. And you'll see this kind of come up along the way. And I will, just so to give you a heads up, not one to shy away from uneasy topics. So I will be bringing up some uneasy topics. And if that's the case for you, I hope you'll just let the unease sit with you and look at it and process it, because I think those kind of uncomfortable spaces are necessary to the kind of work that we're doing. So the first thing we want to know when we're talking about community engagement is what we mean by community. If your strategy is to reach all of a very large metropolitan area, you probably won't. So it's a matter of thinking about which neighborhoods, which schools are you looking at, because those strategies need to be differentiated to the people of particular communities. If your idea is to reach an entire city or metropolitan area, then what you'll probably end up doing is reaching the most visible, the most accessible, the ones with least barriers to services. So really narrowing down who you're talking about when you're talking about community engagement. Who are you wanting to engage with? And just asking yourselves some questions to figure out who this community is. A lot of us work with communities outside of, where we live, or the communities that we ourselves grew up in or live in. So it's important that we really figure out, what are we talking about? What are the boundaries? Is it a neighborhood? Is it a school feeder system? Is it one particular side of town that has a lot in common? All of this stuff needs to kind of be parsed out as you're trying to figure out what your community engagement is going to look like. And making sure that you're paying attention to what issues are important to these particular communities, not just in terms of what's lacking, but also what's there, what are their strengths. And for those working in communities that have been historically marginalized, that have been historically under-resourced, it's really important to make sure that to pay attention to the assets as well, and to see the strength that resides in those communities and not just the needs. And then as you think about those boundaries, understanding them as porous. So what's important to those communities that might reside outside those boundaries? And I highly suggest, as you start to engage in your community engagement, as you start really seeking more collaborative relationships with individuals and with different institutions and agencies, that you keep track of that. One way to do that would be creating your own very private Google map, but you can code it and, you know, define the quality of your relationship and take screenshots of it over time, and be able to really see what's worked, what hasn't worked, and take stock of your efforts. For those of you who know me, you know I'm big into evaluation, so I think that this is a very simple way to kind of evaluate your own efforts and what relationships seem to be working, what relationships are growing, and what strategies have you used to grow those relationships. Because at its core, when we're talking about community engagement, we're talking about building and sustaining relationships. You know, I mentioned, you know, the whole 5 fingers in a palm, but what makes it a hand, a proper hand, are the connections between the palm and the fingers and the thumb, those sinews, those muscles, how they work in concert together. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about community engagement. So it's going to look like I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent right now. I'm going to walk away from this. Well, this is a rather cold beach to walk away from, so maybe we should. But it's going to look a little bit grim for a second. But please bear with me, because it will make sense by the time I get around to it. So an important part of this building and sustaining relationships is really taking stock of ourselves. And as I said, often when we're talking about community engagement, we're talking about those of us who are doing community engaging who are not from the communities that we are trying to engage with. So that means that we have a lot of learning and unlearning before we can really be successful at community engagement, and we need to take stock of what we ourselves are offering. Quickly in the chat box, how many are familiar with the Implicit Bias project? You can just type in a quick yes or no. A couple of yeses, but lots of no's. So, an enthusiastic yes, that's great to see. Implicit bias really refers to attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, our actions, our decisions, but on an unconscious level, right? These are these instant associations, those snap judgments we make before we even formulate a coherent or a cohesive thought. And for those who are interested in digging more, this is the actual website for Project Implicit, and it's also in the resources webpage that I'll show you at the end of the webinar. And in the chat box, thank you, Emiliano. So I took a race and weapons test not too long ago before I did this, because I think you should do what you tell people to do. And it showed me the results of everybody who has taken the surveys themselves. So here's what it showed me. Of those of us who took the implicit bias on race and weapons, 71% associate blacks with weapons and whites with harmless objects. So without even thinking, that first reaction before you have a cohesive thought is that blacks have weapons and whites don't. And if we dig deeper into this, and see what type of association. You'll see that of that 71%, more than 50% of that association is a strong to moderate one, which is scary. But it tells us that every single one of us have been told certain stories, particular stories, and these are sexist, classist, racist stories. Some of them are fairy tales and some of them are horror stories, depending on the communities with which we work, and about ourselves. We've absorbed them without thinking. Anyone who's watched movies, anyone who's got a TV, anyone who's listened to the hush tones of their family members that close into something being unacceptable. These stories color how we see people, and we, as we embark in community engagement, we are the work. So we need to take constant stock of ourselves and our assumptions and be sure that we're offering communities more than preconceived stereotypes and plans to save them from themselves. Which I know sounds really harsh, but I include myself in that work. And it's our jobs to unlearn those stories as we do community engagement work, that we've been told about them, and learn the stories that they tell themselves. I realize that this slide has the potential for seeming overly simple and maybe even asinine, but to be curious, to be genuinely curious, is to actively listen to understand. And for those of us in, the grant world, we've become accustomed to using language that indicates challenges and disadvantage, language like at risk, or low income, or marginalized, or under-resourced, and other more problematic shorthand that we hear, as slang, like ghetto, or the projects, or kids, or teens, or frats, and these all tend to echo these kind of predetermined stories. So community engagement, the reason I'm going on about this, is because it's seeing these communities beyond these labels, and to get into the profundity, the richness, the complexity that is the work itself, and not get caught up in these kind of broad stroke brushes that we tend to paint because they're easier, they take less time, with the communities that we're working in. And again, while they're not a sum of their parts, they're also not a monolith. So it's a matter of being present and being curious. And on a similar vein, thanks to fabulous Isha Jenkins, do your homework. So before we even go in, find out as much as we can. Try not to ask questions that Google can answer. Use your Google machine, but use it wisely. Be selective of your sources, and read their stories. If working with a spiritual community, make sure that you have a basic understanding of what that community is like, what its common and important practices are. Find out as much as you can about the history of a community, its triumphs, its tensions, because while they can definitely teach you, it's not their job to teach you. Right? We want to be curious, but we don't want to be lazy, and that's a fine little balance walk to try to do. So we're going to now talk about a couple of approaches that hopefully will be helpful in doing just that and kind of guiding your decisions. Before we do that, any questions up till now? That was the more serious portion of the webinar. We'll get into more solution-focused strategies. This is not a speak now or forever hold your peace, so if anything comes to mind, feel free to type that in. So oftentimes our work, our grant money, silence us into kind of single issues, right? There's sexual violence, there's domestic violence, there's diabetes, there's gang violence, there's obesity, and so we can lose sight of how these common threads of our connect us and kind of the bigger picture of what these communities are like. And we have to understand that those who we seek to engage as whole people, right, as whole communities, and not just our one little issue area, which is oftentimes contrary to what your funding tells you to do. But it's connected, right? Anti-sexual violence work is anti-sexism work, which is anti-oppression work. So this is a tool from the Prevention Institute, which is called Thrive, which I think is helpful in kind of appreciating kind of the big picture of the what we call the social determinants of health, right? These kind of sociocultural, physical, built, economic, educational environments that can affect health and safety outcomes. And so if you take a look at what's there for people and place and equitable opportunity, all these things that kind of make up a community, you'll see things that are definitely related to sexual violence, right? That either increase vulnerability or increase opportunity for perpetration. So things like getting around and transportation, access to housing, living wages, local wealth, norms and culture, which we talk a lot about, particularly for those who are RPE in Texas in phase 1, and hopefully on and on throughout all of the phases. And I think this is important not just for the big picture, but it's also, you know, finding out what issues are important to them at that particular time and place, so that, in the words of Shelley Collins, you help them get what they need. Because it's hard to talk about problematic gender norms if you're hungry. And all of these things are connected, right? Our funding is really restricting sometimes in terms of our activities, but you can find partners who can complement your services to the community. And Shelley was an amazing pro at this. You know, she'd bring in people who could help them renew their HHS applications or their give them haircuts. So just appreciating people for what their everyday lives are, to help them be in a better position to talk about what you're hoping to talk about as well, and make those connections of how this is all related. Quickly in the text box, who's heard of the words evidence-based practice? Who's familiar, maybe not just heard, who's familiar with the term evidence-based practice? Lots of yeses. Excellent. Oh, good. Well, then I'm not going to cover very much of that. I am going to, so this is the CDC's model for evidence-based practice. For those who have not heard of it and have not typed in, it's really just an approach to make programmatic decisions. So if you look at the CDC model, what do you notice? What type of knowledge do you see being privileged in this approach? If you could just take a look and then type into the text box, whose knowledge is really valued in this model? We've got things like best available research evidence. Who tends to create that research evidence? Whose knowledge is valued in this model? Past researchers, excellent. Population characteristics, needs, values, and preferences. Where does that information come from, do y'all think? Professionals in the field, excellent. Previous researchers and programs, client experiences. All right. So I think this is one that is often referred to. Thank you, Sam, definitely. People who tend to be white, straight, middle class, etc. Absolutely. So this is a pretty typical thing that people are encouraged to use while making programmatic decisions. And I'm going to share with you guys a model that was recently developed by the National Latino Network, which is the community-centered evidence-based practice approach. So in the chat box, what differences do you notice? Absolutely. Yeah, it's really centering the community members' expertise, who may or may not be clients, right? It's broadening evidence to documented evidence, not just published academic evidence. And it's opening up this idea of who the practitioners are and what kind of expertise. You'll see the direct link to this particular approach, but there's the National Latino Network's website right there, which I highly encourage you to go to. So the reason I bring this up and promote it is because community engagement can and should inform your programming. And if you're not engaged in that constant, that long-term community engagement, really think about who's being centered in your programming. And we'll get into a little bit more about what that can look like in practice. Any questions up to here? I know I just threw a whole bunch of Venn diagram looking things, but I think they're really helpful in terms of keeping our focus on community engagement and what that actually looks like and how that can be meaningful. All right. So at the core of community engagement is relationships, but what do we hope to do with those relationships? Even the word prevention can mean that you want to keep something from happening. But what I'd like us to really think about is how do we go beyond that kind of negative mentality of keeping something from happening into going to a place where you're opening a space where something can grow, where those connections can grow, and where the community can develop their own solutions. And the image that you're seeing here is an effort to reinvigorate destroyed coral reefs, right? So they really just provide the structure and the reef is growing itself. They just needed that particular type of space. So how do we do that? I'm going to share with you, it was a quote that I was introduced to, oh gosh, a gazillion lives ago as I first started embarking in community development work and community engagement work. And as we seek to create these spaces, I think it challenges to not let our ego get in the way of our best work. The quote was, "The greatest leader is one people barely know exists. Next comes one whom they love and praise. Next comes one whom they fear. Worst is one whom they despise and defy. When a leader trusts no one trusts the leader. The greatest leader speaks little, they never speak carelessly. They work without self-interest and leave no trace. And when all is finished, the people say, we did it ourselves." Which is very counterculture to the way we typically do things. And the way our grants work, and the way we get funding by claiming that we did something, that we have possession of this one particular, or we are responsible for making this one particular change happen. And it's contrary to real community engagement work, right? To real community mobilization. So how do we go about doing that? We've talked about relationships, we've talked about opening space and developing an approach to determining programming and community engagement strategies. So now what? What do those strategies look like? And this is where it takes a lot more creativity and improvisation. So this is a process that, I mentioned Thrive, which kind of helped look at people, places, and opportunities. So this is a process that they talked about, which is very simple, very kind of scientific method: engage and partner, foster shared understanding, assess, plan, and act to measure progress, right? 5 easy steps. So we're talking about community engagement, which is an ongoing long-term processes. So using processes from evaluation like the feedback loop, from developmental evaluation, and for our understanding of group development, right, of groups forming, of them storming in activities, of them norming, performing, and then either adjourning or transforming. I adapt this into more of a loop and added that 6th step, which is to learn and adapt, and then to start that process over again, right? So either maybe you need to engage with new partners, maybe you need to keep the same partners, but come to a different type of understanding about what needs to be done and who should be doing it. Because the goal is not to replicate this every year, right? Like every grant cycle, but to continuously learn together, adapt, and transform, because ultimately we want our community engagement to be transformative, right? We're seeking to transform social norms. We're seeking to transform communities into safe places for everybody, which is going to take a long time and a lot of different cycles through this before we can work ourselves out of a job. So most of the tools that I'll be sharing now are going to be useful for those first 3 steps, because that's really all I can realistically fit into a webinar. And the 4th, 5th, and 6th require a little bit more, I think, technical know-how in terms of actually looking into measuring the progress and coordinating those efforts. But as we talk about these different kind of tools and strategies that you use in those first 3 steps, what I really want to emphasize is that we're talking about process over product. And a lot of times we're really anxious to be like, look, we did this, we have made X. Versus really paying attention to how these things come about, how these different efforts, events, whatever it is that you're hoping to do and engage with, come about. So Crystal, who's over at the Concho Valley Rape Crisis Center, gave this really fabulous, simple, but often forgotten kind of advice about just really being genuine about the work, right? Being genuine with the people that you're engaging with, and modeling and walking the walk on the same healthy relationship skills that we advocate for, and seeing them as more than just colleagues, and to really see it as an investment and as an opportunity to really learn together. So in terms of that learning, we tend to hear really formal words like focus grouping or interviewing, or for those of you who've done anthropology, like participatory observation. And I would encourage you to use those tools, but use them in a systematically informal way, right? Don't have like capital P, participatory, capital O observation, but really just being able to kind of sit back and watch and learn and getting to know people. When we're talking about focus grouping, we're really just talking about having a conversation with people like you would at a coffee house or in someone's living room. So being able to kind of see it outside of these really formal paradigms, but still being able to do all of that curious behavior that we talked about early on. And when it comes to facilitating discussions, I think there's a lot of really useful tools that we can help to kind of guide those spaces and open those spaces up to be a little bit more democratic, a little bit more open towards engaging with communities, getting their input, getting their perspectives, and seeing how they're willing to engage in the work. So here we've got popular education, which I think a lot of people are familiar with the art of hosting, and with liberating structures. All of these things you can find in the resource page coming up at the end of this webinar. It's just a Google page that I continuously update with even more resources. So if you saw it at the TAASA conference, then you might want to check back on it because some things got added. We also have things like photo facilitation cards, which are kind of a way of getting people outside of, you know, a very kind of verbal answer, and really being able to spark their imagination with a visual cue. It tends to, we've used this in we use this in our curriculum, and we've used this at some of our workshops, and it's really interesting how, you know, people will look at a weed and come up with one answer, and another person will look at a weed and come up with a completely different one. But it allows for that kind of more open-ended conversation that will help provide insight that you wouldn't even think to ask, or you wouldn't know how to ask, right? But that people can volunteer and can share. There's also things like rich pictures, which I love. They're incredibly messy. This is a very neat one, where you get groups of people to get together and draw their concept out of something. So I think this was one about an HIV program, but it helps you kind of, you know, particularly for those who English isn't their first language, where the thought of writing a paragraph or trying to be articulate is a little bit daunting. Being able to draw some stick figures and some arrows and then be able to kind of describe that is a little bit less scary. And again, I'm really just kind of mentioning these as resources. If you're interested in actually doing them and learning more about them, please by all means reach out to me and check out the resources on the resources page. I know that a lot of people have become interested in photo voice, which I think is amazing. It's kind of an extension of popular education that allows people to tell their stories with a picture and is able to draw in those crucial insights and let people share at the level that they're comfortable sharing at. And again, you know, this tends to be information that is hard to ask for. But, you know, if you have a good question, like what does being safe mean to you, then you get all sorts of perspectives on how they view safety, right? And what that looks like for them. This happens to be, I think, like a Future Farmers of America project, but I know that the Asian Family Support Services of Austin has been doing a photo voice project with some of their refugee girls groups, which have really had some interesting results. So it's a really neat project to undertake and get that kind of community perspective. And then there's those kind of more traditional storytelling and narrative arts, and that can be done, you know, low tech, with just, you know, people sitting around a circle and telling stories, or writing poetry or whatever you think is actually culturally meaningful for that particular community, or it can be done in a digital way. And someone's asking if these slides would be available. Is there a particular part of the slides? Just because there's not a whole lot of content on the slides, most of which you're going to be able to find that I allude to are going to be on the resource pages. So if you're interested in a particular slide, please go ahead and contact me, but I wasn't planning on making these slides all cohesively available. And whatever process you decide to adopt, whatever tools you decide to use or you think will be really effective in your community engagement strategies, I really encourage you to think about that compass about power sharing, and to be sure to share the wheel, because it can be easy to be in the thick of deadlines, which sometimes are very real, but sometimes also self-imposed, and this team knows all about that. And to take the quicker and the easier route, which is to do it yourself, right, or to do it all in-house. So believe me when I say that I'm preaching to myself here as well. Because it takes time, and it's messy, and communities are human. And for those of you on, Texas RPE, for those of you who are going to be doing phase 2, which is an action-oriented programming, this is a great way to support youth-led activism, right? So they're the ones pushing for change in their communities. So keeping those ideas of sharing power and responsibility, as opposed to responsibility down, right, as opposed to responsibility up, is really quite counterculture to many grant funding structures and grant seeking behaviors and organizational structures, particularly for those of us who have really become professionalized. So keep a constant eye on your compasses. It's important that we check ourselves and to whom we are most accountable in our community engagement work. One of our rock star youth development prevention workers talked about at the workshop during the TAASA conference that her passion for the work comes secondary to her passion for her young people, which I think really tells you where her compass lies, right? Who she finds herself accountable to. And I thought that was particularly telling and inspiring, that we're thinking about to whom we're accountable and with whom these decisions are being made. So once you collect all of that information and you're engaging these communities, does it end with just information collecting, or are they going to be a part of how that engagement affects programming and how it's done? So during this often mentioned workshop that happened at the TAASA conference, I asked the question, after a much shorter string of content slides, what could possibly go wrong with community engagement, right? So if you wanted to ensure that the communities that you want to serve or that you currently serve are completely disengaged and distrustful of your agency, what should you do, right? What is the complete wrong way to go about community engagement? So take a second, think about it, and write your answers in the chat box. Make wide assumptions about the community, be judgmental and dismissive of their ideas, beliefs, and perspectives. These are excellent, excellent don'ts. Big I love you. I like it, Vanessa. Not listen to the restrictions in a school. Haha, make it seem as if your cause is more important or deserves more attention. Refusing to interact with community members as equal stakeholders. I love that. Donnie, you've touched on one of my the words that I absolutely hate most, which is stakeholders, because it's used to hide so much. Oftentimes we'll use the word stakeholders, and it assumes that we're talking about anyone who's involved in the community, but oftentimes it means the grantors or your board members, right? As opposed to really being grounded in the communities that you're working with. So thank you for that. Not allowing a give and take. Absolutely. So you guys are spot on with what the participants in that session came about with. I know a lot of people work in a little bit more conservative environments than Austin, Texas, so talk about politics and religion came up pretty close. Prejudice from the get-go, absolutely, Bertha. And you'll see some commonalities with what you guys have entered into the chat box. Thank you, and I will continue to develop these slides and add your input in there, if you don't mind. But yeah, absolutely, not following through with commitments, practice off stereotypes, which you guys touched on. Inconsistency with staff is a real thing, right? We know that the money is not fabulous in nonprofit work, and that the stresses are many, which often leads to high staff turnover. And when we're talking about community engagement, it really requires a consistent, dedicated presence with those communities. So that's a real thing. Telling them what they need, y'all talked about that, being condescending. So lots of good don'ts. So let's go positive. So we talked about, how this is about relationships, how this is not formulaic, how it's good to have approaches, but, there's no clear step 1, step 2, step 3 on how this actually gets done. So take a second, and this might take a little bit more time, so I'm okay with a little bit of silence. Oh, thank you, Bertha. Language barrier not being an important matter. Take some time and think about, what do you think are your minimum requirements as you go forth in community engagement, right? As you develop your approach and tools. And if you can not do this and still achieve your purpose, then we're gonna not call it a minimum requirement, right? So what's an absolute must do? So I'll give y'all a minute or so to think about it, and please enter in your thoughts into the chat box. Keep clients' best interests in mind. Thank you, Lucy. Provide a service to a target population. This one's a bit tougher, right? This one in terms of like concretely thinking about what you absolutely must do and how to do it, takes a little bit more thought. Y'all don't have the luxury of the 20 minutes that I gave the people in the workshop. So let me share thank you, Vanessa, advocate for victims of crime. Wendy, make sure you have recent updates about the community. Absolutely. So this is some of the things that we came up with during the workshop. Cultural competency, educating yourself before you go out into a community and being open to learning when you do go out. Along with this idea of cultural competencies, this idea of cultural humility, right? Which is like this kind of lifelong journey of learning. And cultural resonance, which I particularly love because it doesn't put the attention on the people who are reaching out. It puts the attention on how it's being received and whether it resonates or doesn't. So definitely, I think these are great minimum requirements. Approaching leaders in the community, not going in with preconceived notions, which people talked about, open-mindedness, find out what community needs and strengths are, trust and rapport, being present and active, knowing your limitations and being honest about those limitations as well, right? So that everybody is got a real similar idea of how far this can go. Having a realistic perception, definition of success, self-care, and then making sure that you know what your purpose is. What are you hoping to gain and what are you hoping to leave, right? What are you hoping to give? So, I mean, again, these aren't like, you know, step one, secure interviews with 5 different community leaders, and then step 2, call leaders to a meeting. This is really a time for you to figure out what feels right and get input about what feels right. I can't say enough that this is not formulaic and it'll look different for every different community that you try to engage in because they are really unique. But it's really a matter of balancing structure and flexibility, of opening that space, but also having a good compass and a good guidance, and being able to adapt as things come up. Because quite honestly, real community engagement work is not easy. It requires big picture thinking and attention to detail. And it requires the ability to be constant in some ways, but flexible in others. And doing all of this while meeting grant requirements and adhering to grant restrictions and maintaining some semblance of work-life balance is not an easy thing. And it can be, quite frankly, very scary because you're really putting yourself out there. You're really, you know, it can feel like you're going out there without a plan. And it's scary to put yourself out there, especially if you're introverted like me. So I'm going to give you a spoiler alert. You're going to mess up. Like, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And it's really about how we handle ourselves when we do mess up and when we do trip. That will determine our success at community engagement and how we hold ourselves accountable for our mistakes and how we make amends for any harms that we cause, but also giving ourselves the grace to not be perfect and to learn and to move ahead. The more you do it, the better you become at it, and you'll start to figure out what works for you and what works with that community, but there's going to be a lot of trial and error. So acknowledging that it's scary, I asked this workshop, if you were 10 times braver or bolder, what would you do tomorrow to develop your agency or your program's community engagement strategy? So take a couple of seconds and think about what you would do if you just had free reign, right? If you just got to be really bold and do community engagement the way that you want to do community engagement, that you believe it should be done, which isn't always the way that it is done. So please feel free to share that in the chat box. Juan says, review what is currently in place and be ready to improve your programs. Absolutely. Sometimes just changing things up is a very bold thing to do, particularly if you're in an agency that has a culture that's very counter to changing things. So thank you for that one. I'll share with you some of the things that got shared at the workshop. And Vanessa just shared target specific groups instead of trying to target the larger populations. I think that's a great strategy, Vanessa. We were lucky that we had some EDs and some CFOs who talked about wanting to change the policy of their organization to change the practice on the ground. Which was amazing to hear, to allow time without reporting, especially if we're talking about being present in the communities that we're hoping to engage in, right? Sometimes that's a little bit hard to put onto a timesheet or to report. To provide more support at an administrative level, we had some person willing to run for governor. And to change perceptions of what nonprofits are and what they do, calling out or perhaps maybe calling in other nonprofits who aren't doing the work, to train staff at the agency, what is their role and how to support all that work. And one person was ready to start a nonprofit run by youth activists, which I love the idea of. So, you know, these run the gamut, and they can seem small, but, you know, ripples kind of make waves sometimes. So as we go along, I really encourage you to seek out other people as you do this. It's really important to get multiple perspectives as you go along and brainstorm and bounce ideas off each other and soundboard. I feel like that's often when the best work happens. Please feel free to reach out to us here at TAASA, to me or to Emiliano and Denise, as you go through with this. And I'm going to ask right now if there's any questions about any, you know, the entire presentation, because we're starting to wrap up. Anything that you would like to address or get off your chest or put to everybody else. While I wait for anyone to formulate their thoughts, I do want to leave you guys with this quote, which I don't think I could find a better way to end this topic than this quote, which comes from Leela Watson, who is a Australian Aboriginal activist, which is, if you've come to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is tied up with mine, then let us work together. So I keep mentioning this mysterious resource page. So here's the website for it. It's just tinyurl.com/comengage. In a situation where we want to have maybe a coffee house conversations, what ideas do you have to invite community members to join? Great question. it really depends on who you're hoping will come. If you're hoping for people who are connected to your agency, maybe there's a technique called snowballing, where you start off with perhaps like a client and have them invite their friends and kind of work from that network out, which gets you a very particular population. But if you're trying to get multiple perspectives of people who've been affected by your programming, that's one way to do it. Another way is to reach out with partner organizations whose issues are similarly aligned and connected with yours, and start to develop relationships there. It really depends on the age group of the people that you're wanting to do, and you've got to think about really logistical issues like, are they at work at a certain time? Are they at school at a certain time? Do they have childcare? Are you providing childcare? And the most, language accessible, childcare accessible, especially if you're hoping to get parents in, is the more that you can provide that accessibility, the better the turnout is likely to be. Depending on the communities, some you put up some flyers, you'll get people, but more often than not, particularly those communities who aren't quite as visible in kind of like the greater community, who tend to stay a little bit more hidden. It takes face-to-face contact. It takes those individual connections beforehand with, maybe a gatekeeper of that community, someone who's very well connected, so that they have buy-in and then they can encourage people to attend. So that's a very complicated answer for your question. Did you have a particular set of community members that you wanted to invite in? Excellent. Yeah, absolutely. Oftentimes, yeah, those gatekeepers are key, really. And, the women that I mentioned earlier, Yolanda and Doña Maria, they taught me the art of what they call pasearing, which is just, going around and sipping coffee with people. But if I wanted people to show up for a meeting, that's what needed to get done in that particular community. So you've got to figure out what works, what speaks to the people that you're trying to reach, and whose input you want and who you want to engage with, and tailor that approach to them. Thank you, everybody. Any other questions? If you have follow-up questions, again, I think my contact info has been posted a couple of times, but feel free to reach out to us. It's the stuff we love to talk about. If you're interested in any of these tools, please, I'm a complete and total nerd about most of those tools, so I'd love to talk to you more about doing that. Yes, Sindal. How do you work to break down barriers with communities who refuse to acknowledge the issue of sexual assault? Oh, that's such a good question. So what I find helpful, particularly with communities who are resistant to talking about these kind of more challenging topics, is to find what the common ground is, right? To find what your common values are, to give them an opportunity to express their values. So if their values are around family and protecting family, then it gives you a way to, and again, a lot of community engagement is meeting people where they're at. So you might not get the conversation to go as far as you'd like to go in one setting or 5 settings. But that idea of planting a seed, right, to have these sustained conversations about what your values are as a community, as especially if there's a cultural, you're referring to school administrators, political officials, and other leaders who don't want to work with your organization. So this is again where I think that you have to really be persistent, but persistent in a different way than we normally think about. We have to think about how success usually begets more success, and this is where your consistent presence and your consistent investment in their school and that particular community, your relevance to that community really stands out and kind of does the promotion for you. And finding allies within those organizations to whisper in the right ears, right? To get people energized about your cause. It usually needs to be a kind of multi-pronged approach, and maybe starting with a smaller ask. So maybe don't be like, hey, I'd like to do 10 sessions in your school off the bat. But this is and this is tricky for anyone who's on RPE because we're limited to what we can do. But being able to use other people in your agency who can, maybe it's just you start off with providing brochures for counselors, and then you move on to having a presentation, and it hurts me to say that as a primary prevention specialist, but this is where you have to get really creative about who in your agency is doing the presentation, and starting small and kind of inching your way into a more trusting relationship with those administrations and those officials. I find especially with those higher up, they're really concerned about their image and how that's portrayed and perceived within the community. So it has to seem at least a little bit safe for them to partner with your agency. So, and again, a not very simple answer for you, but I hope that was somewhat helpful. And if you'd like to talk more about it and kind of let me know the details about what you're doing, I'm happy to do that. All right, what timing? An hour and 15 minutes, almost exactly. So I am going to say thank you very much to everyone. Absolutely, Sundal. Please email me whatever your questions. I'm happy to soundboard ideas with you. So yes, and I'll, so you don't have to scroll up all the way to the top. There it is for you. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for joining me on this Friday, TGIF. I hope that you get to walk away with a couple of ideas, and thank you so much. I'm honored that you spent your time with me, and good luck on all your efforts. Please do share what you've got going on with us. We'd love to hear about it. Have a great Friday.